Okay, so I suppose maybe now would be a good time for me, as ever, to go ahead and bring up this subject onto the table. And this is going to be one of the most controversy subjects that I'm going to bring up, followed by probably the most clickbaity, coming from my end of the spectrum. And coming from me, this is going to be the most craziest, bizarre thing to hear me actually say, considering the fact of who you are looking at, who you are dealing with, a Sony fanboy. Proof of evidence, anything else that I need to bring out onto the table. If you want me to bring the whole entire shelf of PlayStation 2s, 3s, and 4 games, sure, I will do that. I am a dedicated Sony fanboy. This is apparent. This is obvious. I cannot hide that fact, even if I tried. But there is something that should be said right now whenever I say this, and it is only because I say this due to experience. Experience in past console generations and past knowledge of what I know of when it comes to gaming. Let's talk about the PlayStation 5, or in my way of saying it, the lack of interest that I have for the PlayStation 5. Now, I know there's a lot of talking going on, I know there's a lot of people talking and everything like that, and there's a huge bunch of techno mumbo jumbo going around and stuff, and while on the one spectrum, it is all good news for us gamers, for us who dedicate our lives into gaming, to fully experience gaming and everything in that nature. That makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense to be invested into this type of element and all this stuff. But I unfortunately have not gained the interest when it comes to wanting a next console generation. Keep in mind, I got a PlayStation 4 roughly whenever I started this YouTube channel. Like, literally, I kid you not, 4.5 years ago, almost 5 years now, I had purchased a PlayStation 4 system. And the reason I bought it was simply because of the fact that there was a number of games that was exclusively released for the PlayStation 4, and I was like, well, I might as well go ahead and keep on the trend, right? And I hadn't regret that decision since. So, where am I getting at whenever I talk about this? The lack of interest for the PlayStation 5. What am I talking about here? Well, there's a set of guidelines that I follow when it comes to jumping on board to a new system. It's the same reason that I'm going to jump in for a Nintendo Switch. It's been the same thing that I've had since the PlayStation 4, as well as the PS3 for that matter. And I've carried that on since then. So it's something that should be carried on, in my personal opinion. Not everyone has to follow these guidelines, but to me, these are guidelines that I follow strictly. So without further ado, allow me to explain further as to what I'm talking about whenever I talk about the next console generation. So when it comes down to any new console that comes out, what is the big notion that you want when it comes to being invested with that new console? I think everyone knows that answer, and it's the easier one, and that is the games. And right now we're kind of in the mix of the release for the PlayStation 5, and now that it's been confirmed 100% now that the PlayStation 5 will be released holiday 2020, meaning November of 2020, the biggest thing now is that what type of games or what large list of games will we be getting for the next console? And that's the thing that needs to be addressed, is the fact that there won't be a abundancy list of games to expect for the next console generation. And because of it being out in the market, there's not going to be a whole lot of games coming out within that month or two. I would say roughly there'll be like 5 games at the time by the time the PlayStation 5 gets released. And this is obvious. The PlayStation 4 was the same way. There was like a handful of games followed by a humongous bunch of games that no one really saw eye to look at. But there was like a good handful of games that people either wanted or thought that it would be interesting to have, per se. In my case, it was Bloodborne, obviously, that eventually came out whenever I got the PlayStation 4. Every other game, however, didn't really pique my interest at that time, period, per se. That's not to say that it wasn't a magnificent system when it first came out, but like all consoles, it takes a while before they get a good lineup of games. And this can also be followed suit whenever the Nintendo Switch first launched. See, people forget, whenever a new system gets launched, it takes a while before that particular system gets a large lineup of games. Yes, you do need a good starting out game to start up the system, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it takes roughly like a year before you get a good handful of games. Hell, 2 years depending on the average consumer. I would argue that it takes 2 years before a single console gets a good runaround for any gaming enthusiast. It's what it is, you know? Once 2 years come around, you have a good lineup of games that people want to have / own for their new console. And by that point, it's no longer a new console, it is a what's the word I'm looking for? It is a console generation that had already been started, and people are now going to get invested. It's more like a snowball effect, if you will. It starts off as a small ball, and then you push it down a hill. And those hills tend to stagger from different direction. So you'll have times where the snowball goes at an angle like this, and it's very slow. But depending on the slope over time, it will get larger and larger until ultimately it will just explode afterwards. So with that notion in mind, as 1 year, 2 year goes by, you'll have more and more games being put onto the system that people want to generally own, or much less want to play. And that's just how it is. With the PlayStation 5, because it is a new console game, we have yet to have seen a list of games that is going to be released. And I'm kind of surprised that some of the selected games that are being put for PlayStation 4 aren't being put on the PlayStation 5. Now, for the record, there was word going around that they will still be making PlayStation 4 games for at least a couple more years after the PS5's initial release. So in other words, we will still be seeing PlayStation 4 games for quite some time. So like, say for example, the newly made Final Fantasy VII Remake, Death Stranding, Last of Us Part 2, those games could have been easily holded on for the PlayStation 5 exclusivity list, to where that way it would have been a massive selling hit. But due to the fact that they are popular titles, and development team don't want to wait any longer for these massive titles to be released, they're going to put it on the PlayStation 4. However, though, due to that physical notion, there will be other games that might potentially be seen on the PlayStation 5. One of them, I predict, is Ghost of Tsushima. We hadn't really heard of a lot of details going on with Ghost of Tsushima, so I want to say that's going to be a PlayStation 5 exclusivity. If not, it's still scheduled for PS4, which would be a very shocking news to hear if that was to be the case. But since we hadn't heard anything within like the past, I want to say almost year now, I want to say Ghost of Tsushima has probably been moved on to the PlayStation 5. I think a lot of people are probably betting on that. But even still, just to buy a system for one game isn't enough for me to say I want to buy that console right when it launches. The next thing that comes into mind when it comes to the new console generation, the PlayStation 5 being per se, would be price-wise. Now, there's been rumors going back and forth between the price range of the PlayStation 5, and roughly it sounds like it's going to be somewhere above $600, and that sounds about right considering all of the computer components that are being put onto the PS5. But as to like any other additional costs or any additional feedback, It's hard to say as of right now because there's a lot of rumors going around, and it's hard to say for sure what is confirmed, what is not confirmed. What we know is what has been stated so far within the past week of what is official news coming from the CEO of Sony, much less for PlayStation in general. So with that being said, price-wise, can be a little bit of a tough situation, especially for like younger gamers for that matter. For us older ones, it's not really a major situation. It's just a matter of like, we could easily hang on to a check or two and we could probably get the system easier that way. But to me, it seems kind of crazy to buy a system on the launch date whenever, again, list of games isn't really built up. And at that time period, keep in mind, holiday 2020, where your spending limit is excruciatingly tight at that point in time. So, to me, personally, whenever I think about it, it's not November, December that makes a perfect time for buying a new console. It is actually, and in terms of American, I'm not sure how it is with other places, but in terms of America, tax season, being that of March/April, is the best time to actually get a new console system. Because of that, you're able to actually not only get a console, but a couple of handful of games to add onto the system as well. And this is kind of what I did with the PlayStation 4 as well. I got it first, and then I got Bloodborne as well as Lords of the Fallen. And Lords of the Fallen was not that good of a game. I'm going to tell you that right now. It wasn't that good. But Bloodborne was definitely the better one. But with that being said, I got that during tax season. And to me, that was better, well spent, than just if I had gotten it on launch date, because technically speaking, the PlayStation 4 was not backwards compatible for the PlayStation 3. And so with that being said, there's no other reason to have a system that technically I don't have any games on whatsoever. If nothing else, it would have been an extension of another Blu-ray system player, DVD player type thing, you know what I mean? Availability. I think this one needs to be stressed whenever I say this. Anytime a new console generation starts, we always seem to suffer when it comes to availability. Now, a lot of people during the holidays will stress out and try to get these new consoles out as soon as they possibly can. The problem with that, you're going to have a number of people who are going to either team up or try to get as many of these new consoles as possible and scalp them for $100, $200 more, and some unexpected parent, much less impatient gamer, is going to actually risk spending $100, $200 extra just to get the newly released system, when in reality there is no reason to do that at all. That's why I said November or December is actually the worst time to get a new console out. And because of this, it makes it harder and harder to get. Whereas if you waited until March or April, or hell, even May, consoles are more flushed out, they're a lot more out there, and you have an easier time to grab them whenever they are available. So there's no rushing to get them, because by that point, if you try to forcefully put in yourself to get that new console on launch date, it becomes more of a hassle, and chances are you're going to miss out on getting it because it's no longer available. So, in my personal opinion, waiting on for that console to be more accessibly available makes it a better option in my personal opinion. This is kind of the same thing as the availability, but in a sense is more different. And that is upgradable. What do I mean by that? Well, in the past, we have always had alternative versions of previous system. With the PlayStation 3, we had the 40, 60, and 80 gigabyte system, which was at the time backwards compatible to PlayStation 2 and 1 games. And then when they had the upgraded version, and then another upgraded version after that, both of which no longer became backwards compatible, then you have the fact that the PlayStation 4 came out, along with the PlayStation 4 Slim and the Pro that came out later on. And then, of course, most recently, the Nintendo Switch having an upgraded version where all it basically is that they switched the chip out to where it doesn't use as much battery life in order to run the game. The game is run smoother with that chip, and there's more battery life in that Switch. So basically, this is more or less of a better version of a Nintendo Switch. The thing is that when it comes to new consoles, when they first come out, freshly, first on the shelf, new system comes out, they're going to have some problems. The Nintendo Switch, I'm sure a lot of people will remember, there have been some slight issues with some people when it came to the Nintendo Switch. Some of which were minor, like it scratched the screen, which makes sense because you're sliding it into the dock. Some experience warping from the plastic because of it overheating. And recently now, that became a now class action lawsuit, is Joy-Con drift, which is a major issue. Some people experience this, some people don't. I know Delmar hasn't really experienced Joy-Con drift, but that's because he goes from using the Joy-Con for the handheld mode to where once he puts it in the dock, he switches to the Pro Controller, because the Pro Controller is actually a way better controller than just playing it with the Joy-Cons and stuff, which makes perfect sense. So in other words, he's not using the Joy-Cons as much, so therefore he doesn't experience Joy-Con drift, but everyone else who has talked about it has experienced it to some degree. And with that being said, so far with this new Switch model that came out recently as of last month, a lot of people have not experienced it yet, but then again, keep in mind, the system has only been out for like about a month now. I'm not talking about the Nintendo Switch Lite, I'm talking about a newer version of the Nintendo Switch. You'll recognize it based on the packaging itself. The original one versus the newer version. If you'll recognize the packaging, you'll know what I mean. So with that being said, and now speaking of which, that's not to say that the PlayStation 4 had problems on its first release, but in my personal opinion, it's probably better just to hold out, so that way whenever you grab the system like a year later, you'll get all of these individual patches and updates and stuff that makes the system a lot more reliable to run, and that any issues that came about when the system first launched had already been taken care of and you didn't have to deal with them to begin with. So in that aspect, waiting for a system, not only in terms of availability, but also in terms of upgradability, allows it for a much more smoother gameplay time. All that being said, there are some aspects that I am looking forward to when it comes to the PlayStation 5. One of which, and it's kind of confusing because a lot of people are stating that it's a rumor, even though technically it wasn't a rumor. So right now it seems kind of confusing that people are kind of going back and forth saying that this is confirmed or unconfirmed. But I still believe that the PlayStation 5 will be backwards compatible for the PlayStation 4. Reason being, the system for the PlayStation 5, from what they said, is no major different in terms of system requirements to run a PlayStation 4 game. So in other words, the PlayStation 5 will be backwards compatible for the PlayStation 4. And why would this be the case, you may ask? Well, from what a lot of people have suggested, it is stated that the load times for the PlayStation 5 accelerate the game faster so that load times will no longer be an issue. So, like for example, games that feature open world maps like The Witcher 3, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Final Fantasy 15, games that feature a humongous load of slow load times, their times would be drastically eliminated practically. So in other words, where you normally see a load screen for roughly about 30 seconds maybe, depending on the amount of data that's being loaded at that time, will now be reduced to practically a matter of a second or two, which is insane to believe that that's the case. And while that would be enough for me to purchase a PlayStation 5, it is not drastically enough of a reason for me to pick it up at launch. Like I said before, based on exclusivity for the PlayStation 5, because according to what we're hearing, they're still going to be making more PlayStation 4 games for the time period, of course. They're the fact that when it first comes out, there may be some difficulty with the system itself, and then accessibility, which will be a pain in the ass to get. So, yeah, if it sounds like I'm not excited for the PlayStation 5, it's because I'm holding off for the PlayStation 5 for at least about a year or two. I think within 2 years' time, the PlayStation 5 will have enough of a reason to actually grab it whenever you can. By that point, there may be another version, which according to a lot of people, there's already a PlayStation 5 Pro that's going to be released, which I think is kind of insane. By that point, there'll be a humongous lot of exclusivity titles being released for the system, and there'll be plenty of reasons to pick one up, maybe with different variants, in fact. So, anyway though guys, I just wanted to talk about the PlayStation 5. I know I hadn't really talked about the system at all, but I felt like I had enough reasons why I wasn't interested in it. It's because of the fact that I'm just going to wait until the system comes out and it's more flushed out and stuff. So, anyway though guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care guys.